We all love a good footballing controversy, don't we? Except, of course, when the controversy involves your team losing out on something. Famously invented by and named after Andrea del Controverso, a Florentine donkey merchant in 1526, controversies have usually found their place in World Cup folklore. From the fat Italian dictator arranging games at the 1934 World Cup to England's dubious goals in the 1966 World Cup final, these incidents have left a somewhat nasty mark on football's biggest competition. And so, with Euros fever in full swing, I wanted to take a look at the history of the Euros and its contentious moments. So, you are cordially invited to join me along this journey, or you can go back to losing at Ultimate Team. The early beginnings of the Euros were already proposed in 1927, when Henri Delaunay, the Secretary General of the French Footballing Federation, saw how much fun the South Americans were having with their Copa America and proposed a similar tournament in Europe. Sadly, Delaunay did not see his dream come to fruition, as the first tournament was created in 1960. The European Nations Cup, as it was called, was somewhat similar to the 2021 edition, with qualifiers being played home and away and the 4 teams that qualified for the semi-final playing it out in France. As soon as the tournament was proposed, there were issues. The English, still only caring about their home championships, abstained, and they were surprisingly joined in opposing the new tournament by West Germany, Italy and the Netherlands. Just like the first World Cup, the tournament went ahead without any regard for the big teams, who thought themselves too good for such a tournament. All went well until the last quarter-final drew together Frankie's Spain with the Soviet Union. As the games were played home and away, the Spaniards threw up a stink about traveling to a communist country, with Franco fearing that a loss might make his political ideology look weaker than the other political ideology. Franco sent clear orders to the Spanish FA to refuse any travel to the Soviet Union, and UEFA tried to mitigate by proposing the game be played at a neutral venue. This time the Soviets said no, and since the Spanish were the ones who created the issue in the first place, they were kicked out. The decision proved instrumental as the Soviets knocked out Czechoslovakia in the semis before winning against Yugoslavia in the final. The irony of the situation was that Spain were clear favourites with a team containing Alfredo Di Stefano, Paco Gento, Luis Suarez and Laszlo Kubala, all coached by the brilliant Helenio Herrera. Some football elitists might argue that this first edition didn't prove much without the likes of Italy and West Germany, but the main rule of football is you have to be there to win it. 4 years later, West Germany still stubbornly refused to take part, and Spain were selected as the hosts of the semi-finals and finals. Despite only retaining Luis Suarez from the aforementioned list, Spain made it to the final where they met the Soviet Union once again. This time Franco was forced to send his team out, and to his delight they beat the Soviets 2-1 at the Santiago Bernabeu, with this trophy remaining their only international honor until 2008. For the 1968 tournament, UEFA introduced qualifying groups for the first time and changed the name of the competition to the Euros. The qualifying groups were real. None of this kumbaya, everyone qualifies eventually, and we send some teams with coefficients through, and we take the Nations League into account as well, and if you reply within 30 days you get a free plushie. No, 8 groups of 4 with only the winners going to Italy to duke it out for the win. Our old frenemies, the Soviet Union, qualified for the semis, where they would meet hosts Italy for a chance to play a 3rd consecutive final. By then, the original form of the Catenaccio was in full swing, implemented by Helenio Herrera at Inter and Nereo Rocco at AC Milan, and the Italians held the Soviets to a 0-0 draw. Extra time wasn't any help either, and with penalties still 2 years away from being introduced at final tournaments, a good old-fashioned coin toss was employed. Giacinto Facchetti, probably the best left-back of all time, I have a video on him, guessed correctly, and Italy were through. In the other semi-final, Yugoslavia and England knocked 7 bells out of each other, and Alan Mallory was somehow the only player sent off, which sealed the win for the Yugoslavs. In the final, the game ended in a draw, but luckily a replay was on hand to save both teams from the ignominy of winning a final tournament on a coin toss. After a pretty uneventful 1972 edition won by West Germany, the Euros headed behind the Iron Curtain for the first time, as the Final Four would play it out in Yugoslavia. The only home nation to emerge out of the qualifying groups surprisingly was Wales. In their first quarter-final leg, held in Zagreb, Yugoslavia confirmed their home advantage with a 2-0 win. The tie was still by no means over, and the Welsh were hoping the crowd at Ninian Park would help them overcome the deficit. What they hadn't reckoned with was East German referee Rudi Glöckner. Rudi decided to hold off the start of the game until an East German flag was flown on top of the stadium. Having had his wish fulfilled, he immediately awarded a very soft penalty to the Yugoslavs, and the tie was sealed despite the Welsh getting one goal back and throwing everything they had at their opponents. The Welsh fans in the stands immediately started rioting after the game, a game which is remembered as the Battle of Ninian Park. In the semi-finals, Czechoslovakia, the surprise package for those who didn't know a lot about football back then, eliminated Johan Cruyff's Netherlands, and Germany overcame Yugoslavia. As all the games of the semi-finals and the third place playoff needed extra time to settle things, the organizers might have felt the final would go the same way and decided on the day of the final no less that the final would be decided by a penalty shootout and not a replay. This meant that the Germans did not have time to practice their spot kicks. Naturally, the game went to penalties, and with scores drawn at 2-2 after extra time, Hoeneß sent his kick over the bar. Antonin Panenka then stepped up and chipped German keeper Sepp Maier, entering football folklore with his Panenka penalty. After the boring and cagey 1980 edition, where hooliganism was the only exciting occurrence, and France's masterclass on home soil in 1984, Euro 1988 was one for the ages. Held in West Germany, the group games and the latter stages would finally be held in the same place. The games themselves were of very high quality, with no one being sent off and no games ending in a draw. The Dutch won the tournament against the Soviets, with Gullit and Van Basten scoring in the final. However, this was not the main source of joy for the Oranje supporters, as they knocked out their bitter rivals West Germany in their home ground in the semis. Dutch total football under Rinus Michels had finally got their revenge on Germany and Franz Beckenbauer, now in the dugout, after the 1974 final. The Dutch players and fans went wild, with supporters burning German flags in the stands and Ronald Koeman swapping shirts with Olaf Thon and then proceeding to wipe his backside with the German jersey in front of the traveling fans. Koeman did not receive any form of ban or suspension for this act, and he could start in defense for his nation in the final. The Netherlands had finally got their hand on a major international trophy, and all was well in the world. Well, not exactly. The Yugoslav wars had begun in 1991, and communist regimes were falling like dominoes all over Eastern Europe. The ensuing instability and violence naturally had its effects on the tournament held in Sweden in 1992. If only they had listened to the Twitter boomers and kept politics out of football. In this final vintage tournament before the expansion to 16 teams and the introduction of the 3-point system, we got the biggest surprise in the history of the Euros up until that point. Whilst the newly crumbling USSR managed to hold their team together under the Commonwealth of Independent States banner, Yugoslavia had just fractured into conflict 1 year prior. Their team had managed to top a group containing Denmark, Northern Ireland, Austria and the Faroes, with the Danes coming in second. As you can't really have a multi-ethnic national team on the pitch in Sweden, just as those same ethnicities fight against each other back home, UEFA decided to ban Yugoslavia. Denmark, the runners-up in Group 4, had to interrupt their break, and no players were lifted off the beaches to join the national team in Sweden. That's an old wives' tale. Luckily for them, they only had a short trip to make to their neighbor's backyard, but one major absence amongst their squad seriously hampered their chances in the eyes of many. The Laudrup brothers had recently announced their retirement from the national team following their unsuccessful qualifying campaign. As the news of their unlikely qualification got to the players, Brian decided to join the team, whilst Michael stayed on vacation, deeming their chances too low. The tournament was surprisingly devoid of big sides, as Spain, Italy and Portugal did not qualify, and the final four consisted of Sweden, Denmark, both benefiting from a tournament played in their backyard, Germany and the Netherlands. England and France found themselves eliminated from a group containing Denmark and Sweden, and in the England-France game, Basile Boli somehow got away with headbutting Stuart Pearce in the face, and the match ended in a draw, meaning big sides cancelled each other out and the outsiders went through. Denmark then managed to overcome the Netherlands in the semis on penalties, with Marco van Basten of all people missing his spot kick, and stunned the Germans 2-0 in the final to complete their most unlikely win in the history of Euros. In 1996, England was selected, in a final reconciliation of the country with UEFA after English hooliganism had blighted Europe throughout the 80s. England had gone through a refresh in terms of footballing infrastructure after the Taylor Report and was keen to show off their hosting credentials. The IRA, however, had other plans, as they detonated a car bomb in central Manchester. Luckily, there were no casualties, but more than 200 people sustained injuries and the city sustained more than £700 million in damages. The group game that was due to be played the next day in Manchester between Russia and Germany went ahead without incident. The culture around England at that time had markedly changed from the dark days of the 80s. Cool Britannia was at its peak, the charts were full of English bands, and England was becoming the fashionable place to be. Somehow, with all that good music, It's Coming Home was created that year and has been haunting us all ever since. England managed to top a group containing the Netherlands, Scotland and Switzerland, with their 2-0 victory at Wembley against Scotland being particularly sweet. It nearly didn't come about though, as in the 77th minute Scotland were awarded a penalty. Gary McAllister's effort was saved by David Seaman, and the replays later showed that the ball seemed to move as he was hitting it. Spoonmaster Uri Geller later claimed that he had been in a helicopter above Wembley and moved the ball through his telekinetic powers. Telekinesis was not needed for England's second goal, and Gascoigne's celebration was a huge middle finger at the time to the British press, who had by then already begun their harassment of the national team. That same vitriol was then directed at the Spanish after England's quarter-final win, with the most disgusting English newspapers rivaling in the chance to mention the Spanish Armada or other grand victories as if somehow their mediocre journalism had anything to do with them. Maybe the posturing in the press came from a place of insecurity over the win, as Spain had 2 disallowed goals, the second one being definitely onside. Despite that, England finally went through on penalties for once in their lives and would meet their perceived rivals Germany in the semis. Shearer scored in the 3rd minute, followed by the favourite player of English commentators, Crunch, 13 minutes later. In extra time, no one scored a golden goal, so England once again had to face a penalty shootout. To cut a long story short, Southgate missed, starred in a Pizza Hut advert, English fans rioted, damaging German cars, and stabbing a Russian student who they thought was German, and Germany beat Czechia in the final. All in all, a classic English performance, which sets us up nicely for Euro 2000, where nothing much happened apart from English and Russian hooligans causing havoc in Belgium, but not the Netherlands, where it was suspected that the local herbs calmed them down. There was nothing to write home about from a tournament where France deservedly won. And then came Euro 2004, probably the craziest final tournament we ever got. Greece deservedly grabbed all the headlines, showing the world what can be done with discipline and dedication even when your talent is deemed subpar by many. But you might be wondering where all the big nations were during Greece's unlikely rise. Well, Spain crashed out of a group containing hosts Portugal, Greece and Russia controversially qualified for the tournament after defeating Wales in the playoffs. Yegor Titov, who starred for Russia in the tie, later tested positive for a banned substance. Wales appealed to UEFA to overturn the result, but UEFA allowed Russia to still take part in the Euros, starting a trend of the footballing establishment having to deal with continuous and centralized efforts by the Russian government to artificially enhance their footballers. Meanwhile, Italy saw Totti banned for spitting on Denmark's Christian Poulsen in their 0-0 draw. Italy then drew again with Sweden, meaning that a draw between the 2 Nordic neighbors would see them both go through at the Italians' expense. The press was of course rife with rumors of collusion, to which both managers responded furiously. Lars Lagerbäck, Sweden's assistant, was quoted as saying Machiavelli might have been Italian and Italians might like to think in a Machiavellian way, but it would not be possible to play for a 2-2 draw against Denmark, and I don't think it will end 2-2. That is a very unusual result. Can you guess how the Sweden-Denmark game ended? Can you? Finally, Germany crashed out, needing a top-to-bottom rebuild after playing more finals than any other nation during the 20th century. This meant that the quarters only featured Portugal, England, France and the Netherlands, from the nations conventionally considered the strongest before the tournament. Cristiano Ronaldo faced off against Wayne Rooney in the first quarter-final as Portugal hosted England in Lisbon. Sadly for England, Rooney, probably the best player of the tournament so far, was forced off through injury and Portugal went through on penalties. England's heartbreak turned to rage at the perceived injustice from referee Urs Meier, who disallowed Sol Campbell's goal. The English press, gracious as ever, then published his home address and he received numerous death threats. So yeah, that was very nice. Portugal would suffer an arguably even bigger heartbreak, and their golden generation went empty-handed against Greece in the final. Euro 2004 was truly the final tournament which could be described as vintage, and 4 years later Spain put everyone to sleep with their passing all the way to the trophy. Turkey's late equalizer against Croatia in the quarters was the only point of contention. The 2008 edition, held in the beautiful scenery of Austria and Switzerland, can genuinely be described as nice, unoffensive, decent, but nothing too wild. Naturally, 2012 was a basket case. The first tournament held in Eastern Europe since 1976, UEFA selected Poland and Ukraine as co-hosts. The Western nations, immediately concerned, started protesting at the perceived inadequacies in facilities and the detainment of pro-European politician Yulia Tymoshenko through a politically motivated court case. The English media naturally pounced on the story, and Panorama, a BBC program, produced one of those classic English documentaries that can be summed up as Englishman goes to faraway place, talks to camera, and shows bad stuff. The program highlighted the behavior of ultras groups in Ukraine and Poland, mainly in regards to white supremacist movements and violence. Many groups and newspapers in the two countries, including anti-racism campaigners and Jewish community leaders, slammed the documentary as a sensationalist piece of media meant to show Eastern European as a hateful backwards place. It was also reported by The Guardian that an interview with a Jewish player from Poland was cut as he did not confirm the crew's anti-Semitism discourse. Now, I won't pretend that such behavior by Eastern European football fans is unheard of, but to create such a holier-than-thou documentary, given England's past issues with hooliganism and the racial abuse issues that still crop up in 2024, is a bit like the bigoted pot calling the bigoted kettle a bigot. The whole 2012 tournament was plagued by fan behavior, from local fans abusing Dutch players in training sessions, to Spanish, Russian and Croatian fans chanting some absolutely horrible things at Mario Balotelli and other black players. Everyone seemed to lose their heads, and even the Germans brought some, quote, inappropriate banners and symbols. In the streets, Russian hooligans clashed with police and their Polish counterparts, and fans from almost every nation found themselves in hot water with the police. So all in all, a pretty distasteful tournament off the pitch. Oh, and Lord Nicholas Bentner showed us his paddy power undies and got fined. UEFA's reaction was naturally a very harsh one for the 2016 edition. Background checks were implemented for traveling fans, steward numbers were nearly quadrupled, police were specially trained in crowd control, and UEFA threatened any unsavory chanting with disqualification. Just kidding, they did nothing and expanded the tournament to 24 teams, because money. Even though the tournament was held in France and not in the dirty, stinky, barbaric Eastern Europe, the clashes between fans were even more violent. England and Russia supporters were the main culprits, but every other nation seemed to have rotten apples in their midst. Russia fired up their bot farms, trying to paint a "they started it" narrative against English fans, whilst English papers described the Russian fans as state-backed hooligans. With the backdrop of the tournament resembling pitched battles, Portugal crawled their way through every game to win the tournament, like a big team, and not like someone like Iceland. They also had 11 men behind the ball, but they're a small team, with a small team mentality. In 2020, the Euros turned 60, and to celebrate such a momentous milestone, former winner of the Euros and former Miss Corruption 2015, proclaimed that this tournament would be a romantic affair held in stadiums all over Europe, a celebration of the Euros. After two violent tournaments marred by hate speech, you'd think the Euros needed to have a reckoning with their identity, not a European Grand Tour. UEFA's plans, which were actually delusions, were hampered by that thing where we all had to be inside and everyone went a bit crazy on the internet. A European tournament could be seen at that point as a beacon of hope amidst a global pandemic, but instead it let everyone's pent-up lockdown crazies loose. With almost every game, issues came up, old and new, from the classic tensions between ex-Yugoslav teams that saw Marko Arnautovic banned for a game after insulting Macedonia's Ezgian Alioski, to issues that have only recently come to the forefront, namely LGBT rights. Viktor Orban, who is so scared of any rainbows and gay people, was very upset that the German stadiums were illuminated in the rainbow flag. Honestly, he needs to get out of the house more. Maybe go to Belgium, attend a party. I hear they're very fun. Similarly, Azerbaijan, the darling of UEFA in recent years, who somehow got hosting rights for the quarterfinals despite never qualifying for the Euros, confiscated rainbow flags, but no one seemed to care, since they're a bit far away and have juicy oil money. The tournament nearly turned completely tragic as Christian Eriksen collapsed during Denmark's game against Finland, suffering cardiac arrest and being later fitted with an implantable cardioverter defibrillator device. Naturally, UEFA wanted the game to go ahead, even after images of Eriksen were broadcast on live TV, still not understanding the concept of fixture congestion and overworking of players. Christian Eriksen thankfully survived this incident, and his teammates embarked on a fairy tale story that ended in the semi-finals against England after Raheem Sterling received the easiest penalty call in the history of the Euros after being basically caressed by Joachim Mehle, with no one noticing there were two balls on the pitch at the time of the incident. Naturally, English fans were gracious to a team that nearly lost one of its members forever and accepted their contentious victory with tact and good manners. I mean, after all, they are civilized English gentlemen. They don't engage in unsavory activities. They only make documentaries highlighting the issues of lesser nations. Yeah, right. The Danish national anthem was booed. They shined lasers into Kasper Schmeichel's eyes. English fans claimed that because England is always cheated by referees, they deserve this win.
This is why the English never win any sport, because everyone else cheats!
They destroyed their own stadium before the final trying to get in, and after they lost the final, the very same black players that were heroes of the nation mere days ago became the target of disgusting and cowardly online abuse, and of course, going on another rampage through English towns after the game, just for good measure. But hey, all is well. Ronaldo took a stand against Coca-Cola and their crimes against the intestines of billions. The world is truly healing, and Ronaldo is truly deserving of his millions of worshippers. And there you have it, every controversy and dark moment in the dishonorable history of this wonderful competition, created through a wish for unity between European nations through friendly competition, but governed by incompetence. It might not be the World Cup in terms of prestige and in terms of controversies, but hey, it's still pretty good. If you think I missed out any incidents, please let me know in the comments, and if you like football stories that aren't the usual tribe of 10 players who you didn't know had beautiful wives, you might consider joining me on my journey to becoming a mediocre YouTuber.